One of the wonders of Melville's Moby Dick is that it's not only a novel about profound subject matter, it's also a novel about the writing of the novel. When you read the first, say, 150 pages of the novel, it feels like a rather rollicking adventure story. A young greenhorn named Ishmael is going to sea. But then suddenly Ahab comes into the book, and the whole novel changes. Well, one reason for this change was Melville meeting Hawthorne. Melville had moved his family to Arrowhead, a big house in Massachusetts, where he could look out at the Berkshire Mountains and think about the backs of whales while he wrote his books. Several of his literary friends came up from New York to spend the weekend with him, and they went on a little literary picnic. And Hawthorne went along as well. Hawthorne didn't know Melville, nor Melville Hawthorne. They'd read each other's work a little bit. Hawthorne, 15 years older than Melville, already a successful writer in particular of short stories, Twice Told Tales, Mosses from an Old Manse. And there was a rainstorm during the picnic, and the two men suddenly found themselves under a rock together, and they started talking, and they hit it off immediately. I mean, Melville was enthusiastic about Hawthorne. He was in love with Hawthorne. There was even a kind of sexual energy that he expressed toward Hawthorne. He loved him so deeply. He worshipped the man. Hawthorne, a little older, a little more aloof, didn't quite return the affection like Melville would have liked to. But meeting Hawthorne opened something in Melville. And even though he had been reading Plato and Shakespeare and Milton before, the example of Hawthorne made him start imagining a new kind of novel for him, a novel that had a kind of psychological depth that he had not attempted before. So soon after meeting Hawthorne, Melville anonymously wrote an essay called Mosses from an Old Manse, which is a review of the Hawthorne and His Mosses. I'm sorry, Hawthorne and His Mosses is the name of the essay. It's a review of Hawthorne's Mosses from an Old Manse. And what he admires in Hawthorne is a deep melancholy that he finds in the great characters of Shakespeare. Here's how Melville puts it. He goes, Hawthorne's soul is shrouded in a blackness 10 times black, but this darkness but gives more effect to the ever-moving dawn that forever advances through it and circumnavigates his world. Whether Hawthorne has simply availed himself of this mystical blackness as a means to the wondrous effects he makes it to produce in his lights and shades, or whether there really lurks in him, perhaps unknown to himself, a touch of puritanic gloom, this I cannot altogether tell. Certain it is, however, that this great power of blackness in him derives its force from its appeals to that Calvinistic sense of innate depravity and original sin, from whose visitations, in some shape or other, no deeply thinking mind is always and wholly free. So he sees this darkness in Hamlet and Richard III and Macbeth and other of Shakespeare's tragic heroes. And suddenly, Melville says, I want to write a novel that Shakespeare would have written if he were living right now. He already said that Hawthorne was doing this. He wanted to do it himself. So the rollicking adventure novel becomes this dark Shakespearean tragedy. But Melville doesn't start over. He just puts Ahab in the book. So it's really interesting that the novel is about his writing of the novel. Now, a little bit more about this power of blackness. Soon after Aristotle was writing, one of his disciples, known as Pseudo Aristotle, wrote a group of problems. They call them philosophical problems. And in his 30th problem, he says, why is it that all great men are somehow tinged with melancholy? Now, this is a major moment in Western culture because it's this line that leads Marsilio Ficino, an Italian philosopher of the 1490s, to say that melancholy, far from something negative, as it was seen as usually in the Middle Ages, is something positive. That philosophers are prone to melancholy, that poets are prone to melancholy. Why is this? If you're melancholy, you're confused, you don't quite feel right in the world, but you're brave enough to sit with the confusion and you work through the confusion, and you often have original thoughts that you wouldn't have had before because you're willing to sit with the confusion. Also, you're restless. You stay up late. You read. You think. So suddenly the melancholiac becomes a sort of ideal of philosophical and literary genius. And we see this manifested most powerfully in the figure of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, the first hero that is more a hero of consciousness than a hero of action. And we see this in some of the great works of the British Romantic era, in particular Keats's Ode on Melancholy. We see it in Byron and Coleridge as well. So Melville's two main characters in Moby Dick are chronically melancholy. Ishmael himself says, "I'm going to the sea to burn off some spleen," which would have been a way of talking about having melancholy, too much spleen. He says, "I want to get away from my hypos," which would be a term for kind of chronic depression. He says, "Instead of killing myself, I take to the sea." So Ishmael is melancholy. He's sad. He's yearning. He's alone. He's confused. Obviously, Ahab is too. Ahab is these things as well. So part of what Melville is doing in Moby Dick is he's exploring this power of blackness by looking at various ways that melancholy can manifest. There's a sense that melancholy can be positive and powerful because it leads to deep thinking and original thought, but also melancholy can be corrosive and destructive because it leads to a flattening out of life into pure negativity. So as you go through the novel, think about, well, how does Ishmael express his melancholy? How does Ahab express his melancholy? And think of it not only in terms of what they say and think, but think about it also in terms of the imagery surrounding them. Ishmael is often associated with spirals and circles, whereas Ahab is often associated with lines and points. So these are just two different sort of image patterns that might reflect two different ways of expressing melancholy. So among the many other things that Moby Dick is, it is a 19th century anatomy of melancholy. It's a handbook for exploring different kinds of melancholy, different effects of melancholy, and the possibility that some forms of melancholia might be positive, other forms profoundly and scarily negative.